In the early years of the Pacific Air War, Japanese fighter pilots believed they understood their enemy completely. They had faced American aircraft over China, over the Philippines, and during the opening months after Pearl Harbor. In almost every engagement, the outcome seemed predictable. Japanese pilots flying the agile Mitsubishi 6M0 could climb faster, turn tighter, and outmaneuver nearly every American fighter sent against them. These victories shaped not only confidence but doctrine. By 1942, many Japanese airmen were convinced that American pilots relied on brute force and inferior machines, lacking the finesse of true aerial warriors. This belief did not appear out of nowhere. Pre-war Japanese naval aviation placed enormous emphasis on individual pilot skill. Long, brutal training programs produced a small but elite cadre of aviators who could extract extraordinary performance from lightweight aircraft. The Zero, designed for range and maneuverability, perfectly matched this philosophy. Against early American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk, Japanese pilots felt untouchable. They could climb above them, outturn them, and disengage at will. Stories spread through squadrons that American planes were slow, heavy, and predictable. At the same time, American aircraft designers were following a very different path. The United States expected a long industrial war, not a short, decisive campaign. Survivability, firepower, and future growth mattered more than extreme agility. This difference in philosophy would soon collide in the skies over the Pacific, but in early 1942, few Japanese pilots saw any reason to worry. When intelligence reports mentioned a strange twin-engine American fighter being deployed to the region, many dismissed it as irrelevant. Two engines meant more weight. More weight meant worse maneuverability. In their minds, the conclusion was obvious. That aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. At first glance, the P-38 seemed to confirm every Japanese assumption. It was large, unlike the slim single-engine fighters they were used to fighting. Its twin booms and central cockpit looked unconventional, even awkward. Japanese pilots joked that it looked more like a bomber than a fighter. Surely, they believed, such a machine could never match the Zero in a turning fight. Surely, it would be slow to climb and easy to escape. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. The P-38 Lightning was not built to fight the war Japan expected. It was built for speed, altitude, and range across vast oceans. Its twin engines gave it redundancy and power unmatched by most fighters of its time. Turbo superchargers allowed it to perform a high altitude where many Japanese aircraft struggled. Most importantly, it carried all its firepower concentrated in the nose, meaning that when a P-38 fired, every bullet and shell struck exactly where the pilot aimed. Early encounters were limited and confusing. Japanese pilots occasionally spotted the unfamiliar aircraft streaking through the sky, faster than expected, often refusing to turn and instead diving away at astonishing speed. Reports filtered back, describing an American fighter that could not be caught in a dive, that climbed better than expected at altitude, and that absorbed damage without immediately falling apart. These reports were often ignored or downplayed. After all, one or two unusual encounters did not overturn years of experience. Confidence remained high. Japanese pilots still believed that if they could force this new fighter into a traditional dogfight, the outcome would be the same as always. Outrun it, outclimb it, outturn it. The Zero had proven itself too many times to doubt. What they did not yet understand was that the P-38 was not designed to play by their rules. American pilots flying the Lightning were trained differently. They were taught never to turn with the Zero, never to bleed speed unnecessarily, and never to fight on terms chosen by the enemy. Instead, they used altitude as a weapon. From high above, P-38s would dive at tremendous speed, unleash a devastating burst of fire, and then climb away using raw power. Japanese pilots who attempted to chase them upward found their engines struggling, their climb rates falling behind. For the first time, Japanese pilots began encountering an American fighter they could neither outrun nor outclimb in certain conditions. The shock was subtle at first, but deeply unsettling. In post-mission discussions, pilots described moments where they pushed their aircraft to the limit, only to see the twin-engine fighters steadily pulling away. Others reported diving after a lightning, confident it would compress or break apart, only to watch it remain stable and disappear below them. This was not supposed to happen. The Zero's legendary maneuverability remained unmatched in close combat, but the P-38 refused to give it that opportunity. Each encounter ended the same way, a brief, violent clash followed by separation on American terms. Slowly, the psychological balance in the air began to shift. The Americans were learning. Worse still, they were adapting faster than expected. Behind these encounters stood the immense industrial power of the United States. While Japan struggled to replace experienced pilots and improve existing designs, American factories were producing improved Lightnings in growing numbers. Each new variant climbed faster, flew farther, and hit harder. The P-38 became not just a fighter, but a long-range escort, a bomber interceptor, and eventually a precision strike aircraft capable of missions no Japanese fighter could match. By mid-war, Japanese pilots no longer laughed when they heard the distinctive silhouette of the P-38 mentioned in briefings. They listened carefully. Survival depended on it. The aircraft they once dismissed had revealed a painful truth. The war in the air was changing, and skill alone was no longer enough to guarantee victory. The shock was not just tactical. It was cultural, for pilots raised to believe that superior maneuverability defined air combat. Facing an enemy who refused to turn and still dominated the fight was deeply unsettling. The Lightning represented a new kind of warfare, one driven by technology, coordination, and overwhelming industrial support. And this was only the beginning. As more P-38s arrived in the Pacific, Japanese pilots would soon face an even harsher reality. Not only could they no longer outrun or outclimb this new enemy, but they were also being hunted across distances they once believed safe. The sky, which had once felt like home, was becoming increasingly hostile. The era of easy victories was over, and the Lightning had announced its arrival. By 1942, Japanese fighter pilots were still riding the confidence earned in the early months of the Pacific War. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Malaya to the Dutch East Indies. It could turn tighter, climb quickly at low speeds, and outmaneuver almost anything the Allies could put in the air. Many Japanese pilots believed speed and agility alone decided aerial combat. What they did not yet understand was that the nature of air warfare was about to change. When the first reports of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning began filtering into Japanese intelligence channels, they were largely dismissed. A twin-engine fighter was seen as heavy, complex, and vulnerable. Two engines meant more maintenance. A larger airframe meant an easier target. Japanese doctrine valued lightness and maneuverability, and anything that sacrificed those qualities was considered inferior. On paper, the Lightning looked like a compromise aircraft, neither as nimble as a Zero, nor as small as traditional fighters. But paper statistics failed to tell the full story. The P-38 was unlike anything the Japanese had faced. Its twin booms housed powerful Allison engines fitted with turbo superchargers, allowing the aircraft to retain power at high altitude. While Zero pilots were used to dominating below 20,000 feet, the Lightning thrived above that range. At altitude, it could cruise faster, climb harder, and dive away with terrifying momentum. Japanese pilots soon learned that once a P-38 decided to disengage, there was almost nothing they could do to stop it. The Lightning's speed advantage was not just theoretical. In level flight, especially above medium altitudes, the P-38 could outrun the Zero. In a dive, the difference became overwhelming. Zero pilots who attempted to follow a Lightning downward often found their controls stiffening as they approached compressibility limits. Many had to pull out to avoid structural failure, watching helplessly as the American fighter vanished below them. This was a psychological shock. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots were facing an enemy aircraft they could not chase at will. The P-38 also introduced a new style of American air combat. Instead of tight-turning dogfights, Lightning pilots were trained to use boom and zoom tactics. They attacked from above, fired a concentrated burst, and used speed to escape upward or downward. The Lightning's nose-mounted armament made this devastatingly effective. For .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon were grouped tightly in the nose, meaning all fire converged at the same point. Unlike wing-mounted guns that required careful convergence, the P-38 delivered its full firepower exactly where the pilot aimed. Japanese pilots quickly noticed that a single firing pass from a Lightning could be fatal. Zeros that survived initial engagements began reporting a disturbing pattern. The P-38 did not need to turn with them. It did not need to slow down. It simply chose when and how to fight. Even experienced Japanese aces found themselves reacting instead of controlling the engagement. This was the opposite of how air combat had gone during the first year of the war. Another surprise was the Lightning's durability. Japanese pilots were used to seeing Allied fighters break apart after a few hits. The Zero, by contrast, was fragile but deadly, built for offense rather than protection. The P-38 reversed that equation. It had armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a rugged airframe. Pilots reported Lightning aircraft returning to base with heavy damage, sometimes missing parts of control surfaces, yet still flying. 4 Japanese aviators trained to expect quick kills. This was deeply unsettling. The Lightning also began appearing in places the Japanese thought were safe. Its long range allowed it to escort bombers and conduct deep patrols over New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and later across vast stretches of the Pacific. Japanese planners had relied on distance as a defensive barrier. Suddenly, American fighters were reaching far beyond expected limits, staying on station longer, and returning home reliably. As encounters multiplied, Japanese combat reports changed in tone. Early dismissals gave way to caution, then to concern. Pilots noted that attempts to outclimb the P-38 failed above certain altitudes. Attempts to outrun it failed in level flight. Attempts to dive away failed due to compressibility limits. The Zero's greatest strength, its turning ability, was becoming irrelevant against an enemy that refused to turn. The realization came slowly but unmistakably. This was not a fighter they could defeat by skill alone. By late 1943, Japanese training manuals quietly began warning pilots not to engage P-38s in prolonged combat. Avoidance, surprise, and teamwork were emphasized, but even these measures often fell short. The Lightning's presence reshaped air battles before shots were even fired. Its speed dictated the terms. Its altitude performance controlled the battlefield. Its firepower punished mistakes instantly. For many Japanese pilots, the P-38 Lightning represented the moment when confidence turned into doubt. The sky was no longer theirs by default. The enemy was no longer inferior. And the war in the air was becoming one of machines, production, and physics, areas where Japan was beginning to fall behind. The shock was not just tactical. It was existential. If American aircraft like the P-38 were only the beginning, what else was coming? By late 1942, Japanese fighter pilots were beginning to notice something deeply unsettling in the skies over the Pacific. The aircraft intercepting them no longer behaved like anything they had trained to defeat. When they pushed their throttles forward and tried to run, the enemy stayed with them. When they pulled up into a climb, the enemy climbed too. And when they attempted the tight turning battles that had defined Japanese air combat doctrine, the enemy simply refused to play along. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was changing the rules of air combat. Japanese pilots flying the A6M0 had been taught that speed and climb were their natural advantages. Against earlier American fighters, this belief had been justified. Many U.S. aircraft were underpowered, lightly armed, and struggled at altitude. Japanese pilots could climb above them, dive, attack, and disengage at will. For months after Pearl Harbor, this pattern repeated itself across the Pacific. Then the P-38 appeared. With two engines, a twin-boom design, and a concentrated nose-mounted battery, the Lightning looked strange even to American pilots. To Japanese observers, it looked almost unnatural. No propeller in the nose. No long fuselage. Just speed, altitude, and firepower coming straight at them. The first shock came at altitude. Japanese pilots discovered that the P-38 could reach and maintain heights where the Zero began to lose performance. Its turbo-supercharged engines allowed it to fight effectively above 30,000 feet. At those altitudes, Japanese engines struggled for power, while the Lightning retained speed and responsiveness. Then came the second shock, straight-line speed. The P-38 was one of the fastest fighters in the world at the time. In a dive, it could accelerate beyond anything the Japanese had faced. Pilots who attempted to escape by diving away found that the Lightning not only followed, but closed the distance. Japanese after-action reports increasingly described an American fighter that could not be shaken once it committed to pursuit. Most unsettling of all was the climb. Japanese pilots had built their entire combat philosophy around vertical maneuvering. They expected to outclimb their opponents, stall them, and strike from above. Against the P-38, this advantage disappeared. American pilots used zoom climbs, converting speed into altitude with brutal efficiency. Japanese pilots who pulled up found themselves still under fire, still tracked, still threatened. The Lightning did not turn as tightly as a Zero, and American pilots knew it. They were trained not to dogfight. Instead, they used energy tactics, high-speed passes, zoom climbs, and disengagements that left Japanese pilots frustrated and confused. The Zero could turn tighter, but it could not catch what refused to turn. Then there was the firepower. Unlike many fighters that spread their guns across the wings, the P-38 carried all its weapons in the nose. For .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon fired in a single, concentrated stream, there is no need to harmonize convergence distances. Wherever the nose pointed, all the fire went. Japanese pilots accustomed to glancing hits suddenly found their aircraft shredded in seconds. A brief burst from a P-38 was often enough to tear apart wings, engines, and control surfaces. Survivors reported that being hit by a Lightning felt less like combat and more like collision with a wall of metal. Psychologically, the effect was devastating. Japanese pilots began to recognize the silhouette. Twin booms meant danger. Twin engines meant pursuit. Twin tails meant there would be no easy escape. Reports filtered up the chain of command warning that this new American fighter could not be outrun, could not be outclimbed, and could not be casually engaged. The myth of Japanese aerial superiority was cracking. American pilots, meanwhile, grew more confident. They learned that the P-38 was not invincible, but it was unforgiving in the right hands. They exploited its strengths mercilessly. They chose when to fight and when to disengage. They dictated altitude, speed, and direction. Every engagement reinforced the lesson. By 1943, Japanese commanders were forced to admit what their pilots already knew in their bones. The skies were no longer theirs. The Lightning had arrived, and it had stripped away the advantages Japan once took for granted. And this was only the beginning, because soon, the P-38 would do far more than just dominate Japanese fighters. It would hunt bombers, escort long-range missions, and carry out one of the most precise aerial interceptions in history, an operation that would send a message across the Pacific that nowhere and no one was beyond reach. By 1943, the air war over the Pacific had entered a brutal new phase. Japanese fighter pilots, many of them veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the early Pacific victories, still believe in the myth of their aircraft superiority. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had built its reputation on agility, climb rate, and the ability to outturn anything it faced. For years, Japanese pilots had survived by dragging American fighters into turning battles, confident that no Western aircraft could stay with them vertically or horizontally. Then the P-38 Lightning arrived in numbers. At first, Japanese pilots dismissed it. The aircraft looked strange, twin booms, a central cockpit, and a silhouette unlike anything flown by Japan. Intelligence officers described it as heavy, oversized, and likely inferior in maneuverability. Some Japanese pilots even joked that such a large aircraft could never survive in close combat against the Zero. Those assumptions would soon prove fatal. The first encounters shocked Japanese aviators. Pilots who attempted to dive away found the Lightning accelerating with terrifying speed. Those who tried to climb discovered something worse. The P-38 did not fall behind. It climbed faster, longer, and at altitudes where Japanese engines began to gasp for power. The Lightning's turbo-supercharged engines allowed it to retain performance at heights where the Zero simply could not operate effectively. Japanese pilots were trained to control the fight by choosing the engagement envelope. Against the P-38, they no longer had that control. American Lightning pilots did not dogfight the way earlier U.S. pilots had. They did not turn with the Zero. They did not try to match its low-speed agility. Instead, they attacked from above, fired, and climbed away again and again, using altitude and speed as weapons. The Zero could not follow without losing energy. Each failed pursuit left Japanese aircraft slower, lower, and more vulnerable. Even more disturbing was the Lightning's firepower. A concentrated burst from its nose-mounted guns meant no convergence issues, no scattered fire. When a P-38 fired, every round traveled straight into the target. Japanese pilots accustomed to surviving glancing hits from wing-mounted guns now faced devastating, instant destruction. Reports from Japanese units began to change in tone. Early confidence gave way to caution. Pilots wrote that the American twin-engine fighter could not be outrun in a dive. Others admitted it could not be outclimbed, no matter how hard they tried. Some stated bluntly that once a P-38 gained altitude advantage, survival depended more on luck than skill. The psychological impact was severe. Japanese air doctrine relied on individual pilot skill and aggressive maneuvering. The P-38 reduced those advantages. It punished mistakes instantly. It refused to fight on Japanese terms. And it appeared in growing numbers over New Guinea, the Solomons, and later the Philippines. One Japanese pilot recalled attempting to lure a Lightning into a turning fight, only to watch it pull up vertically and vanish into the clouds. Moments later, it reappeared from above, firing as it descended. The Zero never saw it coming. As weeks turned into months, Japanese commanders noticed another alarming trend. The most experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The Lightning hunted them specifically, targeting flight leaders and veterans. The new American aircraft was not just winning battles, it was dismantling the institutional memory of Japan's air forces. For the first time, Japanese pilots openly acknowledged an American fighter they could neither outrun nor outclimb. The sky, once their domain, had become hostile territory. And this was only the beginning. By late 1943, Japanese pilots across the Pacific were beginning to notice a pattern that no training manual could explain away. The American twin-engine fighter that kept appearing over vast stretches of ocean was not just fast. It was everywhere. The P-38 Lightning did not rely on aircraft carriers the way other fighters did. It crossed distances Japanese pilots believed were impossible for single-seat fighters, arriving where no enemy aircraft was expected to be. Veteran Zero pilots reported encounters where they dove hard, expecting to leave the American behind, only to see the Lightning remain glued to their tail. Others tried to climb, believing altitude was still their advantage, but the P-38 kept rising with them, its turbo superchargers feeding power into its engines where Japanese fighters began to gasp. This was deeply unsettling. Japanese doctrine had always emphasized agility and pilot skill over raw industrial power. But the P-38 represented something different, a machine designed to remove limitations. It could fly higher without losing power. It could dive faster without structural failure. And most frightening of all, it could fight at long range, where Japanese aircraft simply could not operate. Combat reports from New Guinea and the Solomon Islands described the same shock again and again. Japanese pilots would spot the distinctive twin booms and assume they could disengage at will. Instead, the Lightning stayed with them, matching every maneuver, forcing the fight into a realm where Japanese aircraft had no answers left. The psychological impact spread faster than the aircraft itself. Rumors circulated through Japanese air units that the Americans had finally built a fighter that ignored the rules of air combat. Pilots began to hesitate before engaging. Fuel calculations became desperate. Missions were shortened not by enemy fire, but by fear of being chased far beyond safe return range. Meanwhile, American pilots learned quickly how to exploit the Lightning's strengths. They avoided turning fights and used altitude, speed, and coordinated attacks. Two engines meant confidence over open water. If one engine failed, the pilot could still bring the aircraft home, something Japanese pilots could rarely imagine. In after-action interviews, captured Japanese airmen admitted that the P-38 changed how they thought about survival. They no longer assumed that skill alone could save them. Against the Lightning, escape itself was no longer guaranteed. The skies over the Pacific were no longer governed by agility and honor. They were ruled by engineering, logistics, and relentless reach. And with every encounter, Japanese pilots realized that the war in the air had shifted permanently. Not because they flew worse, but because America had built an aircraft that refused to be outrun, outclimbed, or ignored. By late 1944, the sky over the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. For years, Japanese pilots had believed speed and climb were everything. The Zero had been designed around that belief. Light, agile, able to turn inside anything in the air. Against early Allied aircraft, that philosophy had worked. But against the P-38 Lightning, it collapsed completely. The Lightning did not try to outturn Japanese fighters. It did not chase them into tight spirals or low-speed dogfights. Instead, it rewrote the rules of air combat. It climbed higher, dived faster, and struck with overwhelming firepower, then disappeared before retaliation was possible. Japanese combat reports began to show a new tone. Pilots described enemy aircraft they could not escape even at full throttle. Others wrote of being attacked from altitudes they believed were unreachable. Many spoke of a strange twin-tailed fighter that seemed to appear out of the sun, fire with devastating accuracy, and vanish into thin air. The psychological effect was profound. 4 Japanese airmen trained to believe they controlled the engagement. The realization that they could neither outrun nor outclimb the enemy was devastating. Speed had been their safety. Altitude had been their shield. The P-38 stripped both away. American pilots understood this advantage and exploited it mercilessly. Lightning formations operated at heights Japanese fighters struggled to reach. They used dive and zoom tactics, converting altitude into speed in ways the Zero simply could not match. A Japanese pilot might see a P-38 for only seconds, long enough to realize escape was impossible. 8 seconds of concentrated fire from 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon were often all it took. The Lightning's durability added another cruel lesson. Japanese pilots who scored hits found the enemy still flying. Engines burned, control surfaces shredded, yet the P-38 kept going. Stories spread of Lightnings returning with one engine shot out, riddled with holes, pilots wounded, aircraft still airborne. That knowledge broke morale faster than losses alone. By 1945, Japanese pilots were no longer asking how to defeat the Lightning. They were asking how to survive it. The imbalance grew worse as experienced Japanese aviators were lost and replaced by barely trained newcomers. These young pilots faced an aircraft that outperformed them in every critical area. They lacked the hours, the fuel, and the confidence to fight back. Many missions ended before combat even began, aborted due to fear or mechanical failure. Meanwhile, American production never slowed. More P-38s arrived. Better radios, improved tactics, refined maintenance. The Lightning became not just a fighter, but a system, a flying extension of American industrial power and strategic doctrine. Its role expanded beyond air combat. P-38s escorted bombers deep into Japanese territory. They hunted shipping, strafed airfields, destroyed supply convoys, and hunted high-value targets. No Japanese aircraft could reliably intercept them. No Japanese pilot could force them into a fair fight. The aircraft that once shocked Japanese aviators became a symbol of inevitability. The sky no longer offered honor, balance, or opportunity, only danger. Japanese commanders understood what this meant. Without air superiority, supply lines collapsed. Training pipelines failed. Naval forces became exposed. The empire's defensive perimeter shrank. With every sortie the P-38 flew unchallenged. The Lightning had not merely outperformed Japanese fighters. It had invalidated the entire philosophy behind them. Speed alone was not enough. Agility alone was not enough. Courage alone was not enough. Against altitude, firepower, durability, coordination, and industrial scale, none of it mattered. When the war ended, surviving Japanese pilots spoke with respect, even awe, of the aircraft they could not escape. They remembered the sound of engines above them, the sudden dive from the sun, the impossible acceleration. They remembered the moment they realized the sky was no longer theirs. The P-38 Lightning did not win the war by itself, but it ensured that Japanese pilots never again fought on equal terms. And once that balance was lost, the outcome was inevitable.